Ani, and welcome to our podcast. The podcast will revolve around a discussion of the road back to Sweetgrass. Nindijnakas Mishkogi Jigankwe. That means my name in Anishinaabe, but my English name is Brooklyn Lipinen, and I have here with me
Ani, Nandamanankwe Indigenous, Nishike and Dodem, Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa Natives and Dao. I said hello, my name is Samantha Gann, is my English name. I'm from the Turtle Clan, and I'm Grand Traverse Band of Odawa Indians. So we'll start our discussion today talking about the names we had just introduced. We want to make it clear and a point that through colonization and through the points that we talked about that were talked about in the book, that our names were taken from us as a way to colonize us and take that identity from us. So when we introduce ourselves in our native language, Anishinaabe Moin, we tend to say our name, which mine is Nantamanankwe. I tend to never explain to somebody what that means to protect my personal sacred meaning of my name. I'm given my gift through that name, so I never really say that. So I tend to say my full introduction, and then when I say it in English, I just say my English name, Samantha, was given to me to protect that sacred meaning of my name. So that goes back to our book, and it connects it to how we think about them being stripped of their name. Joe talks about him being stripped of his own name as a kid, being given the name Joe by the person who was giving them their land allotment. So that connects back to how we think about them stripping their identity. So we tend nowadays, in modern days, we keep that name sacred and hidden from whomever. That includes from other natives. If they tend to ask, we share that with them if we feel comfortable. It's usually tradition to hand tobacco to someone if you ask them their name. But introducing yourself to a non-native, it is very common to not give that name because it was stripped from us. So it's a form of reclaiming our own identity through that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to follow with that, that this was one of the major points overall in the book, but it's primarily talking about these colonization effects and how these modern times are shaped by colonization. I guess I'll just kind of dabble into what our points were here and what the overall themes we kind of came up with as we read. This overall arching point, I guess, of identity in these stories, especially when we think about dreams and culture to Indigenous people, was our main point. But our subpoints that we came to was this colonization effect and the modern times that kind of shaped this. But the connection to land as Indigenous people, that it shapes our identity. But following with that, how love and balance of Indigenous peoples also shapes their lives and what that looks like, and we'll discuss that. And then at the end, we're going to just follow up and discuss some questions and wrap everything up, and hopefully we'll give you a good idea of the history, the culture, and kind of what this means to us personally, but also what the story means in cultural context to all Indigenous peoples. And so we're just going to start off by talking about colonization effects in modern times, just kind of how that shapes culture, and relate that to our own experiences. But Sam, just give me an idea of what you're thinking about with this topic, what you came up with, and just kind of discuss the different points that you came up with, and then I'll kind of just come in with you and chime in.
Okay, so thanks, Brooke. So when we talk about colonization, and it's a common theme throughout this book of what it means to both hold traditional values and then integrate them into a modern world that's changing through colonization. So relating that back to your own experiences. So you don't have to be an Indigenous person to feel the effects of colonization in modern day. The effects of, a changing environment that, for an example, changing wages that you cannot compete with as a college student. That's the effects of colonization, effects of patriarchy, and everything else. So relating that back to your own experiences, like how do you feel about a changing world that this college and institution is trying to prepare you for, and yet, maybe you come from a remote area that you've never been in a situation like this, so it's trying to adapt to a new way of thinking, a new way of operating through colonization. We related that back to the text by going through the name change when Joe and his family had to take on English names to hide their true identity, and that was stripped from them. Thinking about how the relocation program that Dale Ann had to suffer through to try and colonize her, where she was introduced to a whole new world, new people, new experiences that ended up resulting in her traumatic sexual assault. We also related it back to one of the last chapters through disrespecting your elders out of ignorance, how that has shaped how we view our elderly population today. That's another effect of colonization when, I think it was Beryl, had to go over to Dagford and tell him that, hey, I will find you a racing partner. I have to step up as an elder because other people are disrespecting you, and they need to understand that she's not going to be around forever. So in her thoughts, she was thinking, you guys need to step up and do this. So maybe it was out of ignorance, and that's a colonized way of thinking about families and your relation and like your how you fit into society and in your community, what your role in the community is. Mm-hmm. Also, we were talking about the effects of colonization on your identity by choosing what you wear or how your hair can look. We related that back to the outfits and uniforms that had to be worn at the casino through Margie, I think, right? Yeah, Margie, yeah. And how she overcame that by adding some beaded earrings, adding a barrette that, highlighted her and her personality, even though she was wearing a colonized uniform, as one way to strip her from her identity. But yet she was, resilient in the fact that she was still able to show that side of her. And I feel like that's a huge overriding theme through this colonization, is that Indigenous people are resilient. Mm-hmm. So next we're going to let Brooke talk a little bit about how we have connection to land as part of our identity, just for all peoples, and returning to your roots as a means of your identity.
So in relation to the book, we kind of saw this a lot. I think we first noticed this when Dale Ann returns to Duluth, and we see it furthermore in the book, but I think the most powerful section for me was at the end when Joe Washington is talking about this Odissima bag, and he's talking about how you always have the place where you're from, no matter if you leave or not. It's always there, and that you'll want to go back to it. So we kind of talk about the connection to land as people in general, but especially so with Native people, this connection to land and sort of this nurturing kind of love that the land gives, but also how it shapes our identity. And I think we see how it shapes identity several times throughout the book, and how it forms these relationships too that we'll talk about later when we talk about Indigenous love and balance. But I think for this sort of theme of returning to your roots kind of personally strikes me as this beautiful kind of, almost like this reincarnation. I don't even like using that word, but this kind of like reincarnation of yourself, at least for me, because I grew up in a very Eurocentric household, very Eurocentric lifestyle. I didn't identify so much as being Native as I am, but as I grew up, I slowly kind of came back to my Native roots, and for me that was a very beautiful turn point in my life, and something that really gave me a lot of peace in my life. And I guess I just can't really explain it. You kind of have to experience that to understand what it feels like, but I would kind of explain it as almost like this nirvana, or like this peace, really. it's a really beautiful thing to come back to who you are, or to even just find that. I think it's something very special. But I found that very recently, actually, within probably the past year of my life, I had started to be really drawn to the indigenous part of me that I had never discovered or really looked into. And I think it's very important that we all do that, whether you're indigenous or not, finding who you are and sort of your, I think your identity is your purpose in a way. Like, I think that once you find that identity and you dig into like your roots, that you find your purpose in life. And for me, that was, I mean, even more important because as an indigenous person, I'm given my gifts as I dive into my culture and as I reciprocate with the Creator and Mother Earth. And as I did that, I've been given beautiful gifts, and I think life is a gift from the Creator, but I think I just continually get these gifts, and I think part of this is, like, this project is even a gift to me just because it is indigenous and sacred to me, and I believe it's also, I mean, you can relate that to any indigenous student. They're going to say, like, this is something very special to them. Me and Sam just, like, collaborating on this project is a beautiful thing in my eyes, but but I think that at the end of the day, when we talk about these returning to roots and things like that, for me that was something very sacred and something that changed my life. And I think that happens for a lot of the people in the book when they sort of go back to these native roots, and we just think about how important it is as indigenous peoples to have that connection to the land and how it shapes their identity. And the part of that is getting to those roots, because I think that you don't understand the connection that you have with the land until you come back to those roots. So it's a beautiful thing, and I just think that we all have to understand that wherever you come from, you always have that place to go back to, and I think that's amazing. But I got really spiritual on you guys, so I'm gonna let Sam follow into this section about, well, we're gonna kind of collab, or, like, you know, as natives say, is spearhead this little convo here about indigenous love and balance, and that's what we're all about here, just love and balance. And I think that's actually one of the greatest parts of this book, is talking about how the relationships support this love and balance that's very pure, even if it doesn't really seem like that in times of jealousy and things like that. We kind of think, like, sort of negatively toward it, but just thinking about how these relationships are not just romantic, how they're platonic, and how there's so much love just being given to one another, and so much understanding, and so much care for each other. I just enjoyed reading that, honestly. It just warmed my heart. I don't know, Sam, like,
Yeah.
what do you think? Come in, because I've been talking for a minute here.
I felt like a common thing for me was just seeing the indigenous love and balance that they give each other, regardless of their relationship. So whether that be platonic or romantic, such as, you know, Joe letting Margie stay without even having to explain herself. You know, he felt her energy is, she just needs a place to be.
Yeah, like, she did. Like, I feel like he understood, like, that she was in this critical point in life where she was, like, heartbroken and just sort of, like, depressed, and it was just a really, like, a hard time for her, and he just kind of, like, came in with that, like, that grandpa love, you know, as weird as it is, you know, but
that ended up being romantic and then resulting having a child. But in the beginning it was platonic. It was, you know, didn't have to be explained, which I find as a common theme throughout the book, is just having that balance and reading someone's energy to know what they need. And not having to explain it. It's a huge part of our culture, you know, reading other people and understanding what they need and giving that of yourself, to not be selfish and letting, you know, it happen instead of I need this and I need that. It's a balance.
Absolutely. I think that is who, I mean, not even just indigenous people, but who we all have to be, is, like, selfless and just loving people. And I think that's just like a very important part of relationships in general, is to just be there for people and to be understanding and not to judge them and to have this pure and like unbiased love for people. And I think that's what connects all these people so much in this reading, is just that unbiased and I don't know, unconditional love in a way. Like, I think they all kind of have that for each other, even if they do fight and argue. I think at the end of the day, they all do genuinely love and care for each other.
Yeah, I feel like that's an overriding theme, not only in the book, but in Indigenous culture.
Yeah.
No matter what, like, we will love our people. We have so much love for our people. There's a lot of lateral violence that goes on, but at the end of the day, we are Indigenous people who love one another and care for each other. And like Brooke said, that's for all people, but I feel like in my own lived experience, that is across, a common theme throughout, like, my raising and me going to college, my family always supporting me, and through finding an Indigenous partner myself, just recognizing that this love transcends generations, and this is what my people fought for, the right for me and him to be together and, eventually have kids maybe, and, fighting for that right to be here and own our land and, decolonize is a huge theme that we're seeing in today's modern society, which is what our ancestors fought for.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a beautiful thing to see, and honestly, I think we already talked about how, like, reading this book and hearing these stories kind of shaped our lives even further, and just almost inspired us with this native love theme that's going on, to just kind of open our hearts more, even as they are, just more, and to love and care for each other, because that's really, I think, what it's about in our culture, is just to really come back to that. I think that's part of our roots, is just this unconditional love, and that we need to get back to that, because life is so busy that we kind of get drawn away from it. So it's just, I think that's really a life lesson in this book, and something that really carried with me, and I think you as well, as we talked about before doing this podcast. But yeah, I think it's a beautiful thing. I don't know, do you have anything else to talk about, or did you want to follow into some discussion questions to wrap it up for these?
I kind of wanted to follow up with discussion questions, just because we're rambling on.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
So I had a few discussion questions. I think Andrea did a great job of taking the questions right out of my mouth and posting them in the module for number 4. But a overriding thought that I had during reading is just, what does a modern Native look like? What do you, as a class, think about when you think about traditional Natives, in the sense of the book, in the sense of our, traditional things that you see, like a headdress or dream catchers? How is that also related to how you think about us in a colonized way, where I walk into that classroom and you look at me, I'm wearing my scrubs, I'm doing my own thing. So how does that combat how you look at a traditional Native? What do they look like?
Yeah, and I think to follow with that, I think a lot of people may not be able to correctly identify what an Indigenous person looks like in modern day, especially when you think about having white-coated natives, such as myself. Because I do have white privilege, I think a lot of people view me as being white initially, unless I disclose my Native identity with them. That's who they're going to view me as. So I think it's important to think about that as well when we're thinking about how we identify modern Natives, and sort of taking an intersectional and unbiased approach to think about all these different avenues that kind of come into play, and all this different history that kind of molds what an Indigenous person is in modern day society.
Okay. And then to wrap up our discussion, I also wanted to ask, because the overriding theme was, leaving home as the means of success. We had talked about that in last week's class. We wanted to ask, what practices did you bring with you to college? What do you still do that reminds you of home, reminds you of your roots? Maybe that's, I brought like a stuffed animal from home that reminds me of my mom, or I cook a traditional meal once a week, or I call my mom or my dad, or I check in on my siblings every once in a while. What reminds you of home while you feel you're being off in college trying to become successful, whatever that means to you?
Yeah. So I guess just discuss those questions and give us some feedback on that. We really appreciate you guys listening. Miigwech.
Yeah, miigwech.
And Bama P.
Bama P. Guadnin.